And now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball during the UVA Reunion's Remixed celebration. My name is Teresa Bryce Bazemore, a class of 1981 alumna of the College of Arts and Sciences. In addition to serving as president and CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, I'm also a reunion co-chair for the class of 1981 Planning Committee. Like many of you, I was fortunate to have Dr. Larry Sabato as a professor during my tenure at UVA. And he really sparked my continued love of policy issues and politics. Larry is the founder and director of the Center of the University of Virginia Center for Politics, and I'm privileged to serve on his advisory board. He's also the University Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia and is the author and editor of 24 books on American politics. In addition, the center has produced many fabulous documentaries, and I recommend that you watch some of them. Many of them are Emmy-winning. During the event, I encourage you to submit questions for Larry on Twitter using hashtag #AskSabato or email goodpolitics@virginia.edu. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Larry, who will provide commentary on the 2020 elections and assess the upcoming 2022 and 2024 electoral environment and races. Thanks again for being here.
Teresa, thank you so much for taking time out of your very, very busy day. You've been enormously successful. We're proud of you at the University of Virginia and, of course, at the Center for Politics, where you serve, as you noted, on our advisory board, and we're privileged to have you. We have to go way back to remember what was happening when you were here at the university and certainly when you were in my class. But it was a yeasty time, as we often say. I guess every year is yeasty anymore. But I thank you so much for the time and effort that you devote to the Center for Politics and to the University of Virginia generally. I'm going to chit-chat a little bit about politics, nothing particularly formal. I'm sorry it isn't in person. I think this is our last Zoom reunions, and we're all happy about that, knock on wood, assuming the pandemic continues to decline, as we all hope it will. But we'll make do, and as we have in classes for the last 15 months or so, it hasn't been easy on the students. I think they did a marvelous job of adapting. They managed to salvage as much of their university careers as they could, and certainly their friendships and the ties they have to the institution continued despite everything. But I don't think any of us would want to go back to pandemic times. But there's a connection with politics, probably a connection to every sector of society. We talk about returning to normal. In fact, the Center for Politics' most recent book, which I've just been prompted to hold up, is called A Return to Normalcy. Question mark. We did add the question mark. Very important to throw that in there. Looking at the 2020 election, as we said, that almost broke America, especially considering what happened on January 6th, and frankly, what is still happening, and the investigation that is not taking place. But we can talk about that a little bit later if you want to. My point would be, and of course, normalcy is the word taken from Warren G. Harding's 1920 campaign for president. I remember that well. I'm sure some of you do. It was a very, very exciting time, exciting campaign. I'm kidding. I don't go back that far, but I've certainly read a lot about it. He came up with the word normalcy, and maybe his only contribution, lasting contribution to American politics and government, but it fit the times. People were tired after World War I, and they were tired of the debate over the League of Nations and tired of the Wilson presidency for various reasons. So normalcy sounded pretty good to them. Of course, in retrospect, we can see there was no return to normalcy. That's impossible. Once you have gone through the kinds of cataclysms that America and the world went through during World War I and afterwards, you don't return to the way things were. And the same is true now. There will be no return to normalcy. There's no return to normalcy because we've learned new ways of working, new ways of relating to friends and family, new ways of teaching, thanks to the pandemic, or maybe no thanks to the pandemic. But the same is also true with the past 4 years, and it's maybe 5 if you count the 2016 campaign. We're not going to return to the way it was. Maybe we'd like to. I think we once had greater faith in democracy and in a belief that democracy would persist and that no other system could possibly prevail or that our system could not collapse. And sadly, we now know otherwise. We now know otherwise. There is no return to the pre-Trump normal. And I'm sure some of the alumni out in live stream land, wherever you're tuning in from, may be supporters of President Trump. I don't tell anybody what to do, but I can certainly tell you that he has weakened small d democracy. And I think that's apparent to anybody who isn't completely biased in his direction. So we have to deal with this now, and we're going to have to do better. We're going to have to find ways to reinforce what we once assumed would always be with us, which is a strong small d democratic system. After January 6th, and I happened to be on doing a program for the University of Virginia. Some of you may have watched. I think you were probably watching television, which is what I would have been doing had we not been doing this televised 6-hour program called Democracy Dialogues, or Dialogues for Democracy, which we had some very interesting interviews set up, some taped ahead of time, like with former Speaker Paul Ryan. He didn't know at the time. We didn't know at the time. We taped it that morning, what would happen at the Capitol that afternoon and evening. So we didn't really discuss January 6th, but we had a number of live interviews, including from people at the White House and at the Capitol. We had expected them to be quiet interviews, and of course, they occurred during the mayhem and the destruction and the disgusting events by a disgusting group of people, insurrectionists, or I prefer to call it a coup attempt, which is what it really was. So we went through that, and it's changed all of us. It's changed our perspective on the American system. It's changed our perspective on American democracy, and will continue to. And so you can't unsee those events. You cannot unexperience those events. They're now part of us. They're part of our history. They're part of our present. And I fear they're also going to be part of our future, particularly the next time we have a closely competitive presidential election, which this was in the Electoral College, but certainly not in the popular vote, but increasingly the popular vote. The will of the people seems to have very little to do with what actually happens in the Electoral College or in the Senate or in a very badly gerrymandered House of Representatives. So a return to normalcy, question mark, the answer is no, and we'll be happy to talk about that more a little bit later. In fact, one of my co-authors here will be on at 1:30, I guess, Eastern time to manage the questions. Kyle Kondik, our managing editor at the Crystal Ball, and we can talk a little bit more about that. And feel free to go to Amazon, even while we're talking. I can't see you. I have no idea where you are, what you're doing. So you can go right to Amazon. It won't interrupt me at all as you order this book. It's a wonderful holiday gift. We like to promote it for July 4th. I know there's no tradition of gift giving on July 4th, but why don't we change that? After all, this is Thomas Jefferson's University, and July 4th is a celebration of American independence and the Declaration of Independence. And I think we know who the principal author of that was. Well, let's talk a little bit. I'm not going to talk much about 2020. I think we're all 2020'd out. If you want to ask questions about it, excuse me, when we come to the question period, you go ahead and do it. But we're not going to dwell on that. We'll talk more about January 6th beyond, which will include the midterm elections of 2022 and the next presidential race, which of course is already underway for 2024. 2022, we had a good crystal ball this morning, which I hope you'll take a look at. You know, that's free. It's available to you and will arrive in your mailboxes whenever we send it out. We normally are doing 2 a week now. We used to do 1 a week every Thursday morning at 6 a.m., but too much politics is happening and too many things are occurring, and we do at least 2 a week during election seasons, the height of election seasons. We've been known to do 3 or more. So that comes to you free as long as you sign up. Just Google Sabato's Crystal Ball and give us any email and you will get it automatically. And we never, ever, ever give out your email addresses to other people. So you don't have to worry about that. January 6th, I watched a little bit of the testimony this morning. I didn't have much time, but a little bit of the testimony of the FBI director about this. And if you listen to at least the part that I listened to, then you realize that without a January 6th commission, and it was an absolute outrage that was not voted on or voted favorably in the Senate. Without a January 6th commission, you're not going to get anything approaching the full story. That's not what the Justice Department is doing. It's not what the FBI is doing. It's not what anybody's doing. They're not looking into the big picture. They're not looking into the whole story. And I think almost anybody, except for the hardcore Trump supporters or cult or whatever you would like to call them, just about everybody wants to know exactly what President Trump's role in that attempted coup was. We already know certain things about it. He certainly encouraged them to move down to the Capitol, and he had been encouraging them and keeping up with them for weeks prior to January 6th. He saw this as the culmination of the events that he had been encouraging ever since the election with his ridiculous, nonsensical claims of election fraud. And if any of you out there believe that there was widespread fraud in that election or that Donald Trump actually won the election, really, I can't help you. You may well be wasting your time. It is an outrage for anybody to believe that nonsense. There is no credible evidence of it. It is obvious that it was invented by Donald Trump to cover up his embarrassment over being defeated as an incumbent president, and defeated rather badly in the popular vote. 7 million votes is nothing to sneeze at. The Electoral College was closer, but of course it was identical, as you know, to Trump's margin in 2016, which he won without the popular vote. Of course, he claimed there was election fraud then. There was no such thing in 2016 either. Illegals didn't provide Hillary Clinton's plurality of 3 million popular votes. And this was more than double that, 7 million in Biden's direction. Although I must say, the fact that the Electoral College in 2000, in 2016, and very nearly in 2020, because if Trump had won about 42,000 more votes scattered in the closest states like Georgia and Arizona and Wisconsin, he would have gotten another 4-year term, even while losing the popular vote by 7 million. We've got a big problem, which of course some of you don't think it's a problem, that the Electoral College is no longer really mirroring the popular vote. And the structure of the Senate is another fundamental problem that we have, and it is a problem. The Senate was designed in the late 1780s, and it really doesn't fit 21st century America, but oh well. And there are other problems as well that we can talk about if you're interested. Some people prefer to be ostriches and just hide from the building crisis that is going to burst out into the open far worse than it did on January 6th in some future year, and I fear that it isn't that far away. Essentially, we're not going to find out the full story of Trump's role in this and what he did or more likely did not do to stop the insurrection, the / attempted coup of January 6th without a full investigation. And you're not going to get it from DOJ, and you're not going to get it from individual congressional committees or a select committee that by its nature will be put together solely by Democrats. If you followed this proposal for the commission, it couldn't have been more bipartisan. The Democrats and Republicans had equal numbers on the commission, and probably the staffers would also have reflected the equal division. But we're not going to get that now in any way, shape, or form, apparently. They're talking about a possible revote, but I don't know where you get the additional Republicans from. Fortunately, there were a few Republicans who were willing to stand up and do the right thing for the country, but not nearly enough. And it's impossible to be even-handed between the parties anymore about matters like this, because one party is simply stymieing the efforts to preserve and protect and strengthen democracy. How do you balance that exactly? How do you balance that? I'm sure some of you are perfectly happy with maybe the way it's unfolding, but for those who are concerned about the future of small d democracy, it's impossible to play this equalizing game or to pretend that both parties are responsible and all the rest of it. Maybe there's some responsibility on both sides, but it's pretty clear which party is causing the crisis in democracy. Okay, so we can talk more about January 6th if you want to during questions. We'll see what you come up with. Some of the questions have come in, and I've seen some of them, and others are apparently coming in now. So right now, Biden has maintained mid 50s popularity, something like that, and mid 50s popularity is reasonably good in a very partisan era, which is what we're in right now. If he can maintain the mid 50s, Democrats have a decent shot at retaining control, maybe of one house in 2022. If he becomes unpopular for any reason, it's difficult to say what it would be. Historically, it's probably most likely to be something connected to the economy. And we'll see how that holds up as the pandemic continues, we hope, to fade. But he's in the mid-50s, and that's about as high as a president's going to get, barring some 9/11 disaster or 9/11 style disaster or level of disaster. Then that might push a president up into the 60s or so. But there's so much partisanship that essentially you're not going to have many Republicans ever support a Democratic president. You're not going to have many Democrats ever support a Republican president. That's how deeply divided we are, and I don't see anything that would shake that up, at least on the horizon currently. For 2022, obviously Biden's level of popularity will matter. He got a little over 51% of the vote. That's his base level. Now, if he falls below 51, if he's in the 40s, there will be problems for Democrats in elections. As you know, Donald Trump never on a single day of his 4-year presidency ever even hit 50%, much less exceeded 50%. He might have on Inauguration Day, but he decided to argue about the size of the crowd and other things. So he never got above 50. Biden is already in a better position, but a better position doesn't guarantee you anything about tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. So that's a critical factor. The state of the economy is as well. War and peace. God forbid that we should have a hot war, an unpopular hot war in particular, but any hot war. And that could be another major factor. Scandal is another major factor. And no, I'm sorry to disappoint some people out there, but I really don't think Hunter Biden qualifies or is going to qualify. What else there is, I don't know. We'll have to see whether any of the investigations ongoing about the departed president will manage to blossom into actual charges and a trial. Who knows? We've been through that even during his term, but it's a little different when you're president. You have a lot more protection than you do when you're out of office, as he is. Although apparently a lot of people in his entourage don't realize that. So those are the factors. Looking at the two houses, you've got a 50-50 Senate, which means nobody really controls it. If it weren't Joe Manchin, it'd be somebody else. If it weren't Kyrsten Sinema, it'd be somebody else. By the way, that's Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, not Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, as Cher now knows. And there are others. There are other Democrats who might at some point be willing to part company with their party, and not necessarily from the middle or right, but from the left. And the left is going to get tired of seeing the Democratic Party steered entirely by a couple of senators who are moderate or moderate conservative, or however you want to term them, meaning Manchin and Sinema. So there's nothing guaranteed as we move forward. So that's 50-50. As I look at the senators coming up, and it's very early, who the heck knows? I don't know what the scandals are going to be. I don't know who the nominees are going to be in some of these states, like Pennsylvania, which could easily be the state that determines which party controls the Senate in the end. But Georgia will be close. North Carolina will be close. Wisconsin will be close. Arizona will be close. Nevada will be close. New Hampshire will be close. And there are probably others we haven't identified at the moment. But I think those are the main states that will end up determining which party gets the Senate. And of course, if you get the Senate, and assuming they don't abolish the filibuster, which I've never believed they would, then you need 60 votes anyway. And so that means deadlock unless you can manage to stuff something in reconciliation. And it's more difficult to do after the recent ruling of the Senate parliamentarian. And the House of Representatives, tiny little margin for Democrats. And that really was the one great surprise of election night, that Democrats lost so many seats, that Biden didn't have the kind of coattails we thought he might have in some areas, or that he didn't do better in some of these states that we thought he or if you judge by the polls, would look better. I'm happy to say that Crystal Ball finished number one in predictions in 2020. The Harvard publication, Harvard Political Review, said we were first, and others have, and we're pleased to accept that. We got 49 out of 50 states right, including ones that were mispredicted by the polls, and the two independent congressional districts, one in Maine and one in Nebraska 2 and Maine 2. So we were very pleased with that. And while we certainly read every poll, we no longer slavishly follow them or believe them. The one I've decided, and there's just so many that were inaccurate in one direction or another, but mainly in a Democratic direction, was that Wisconsin poll taken by the Washington Post and I think ABC just a couple of days before the election, a few days before the actual election, that had Biden winning Wisconsin by 17 points. And of course, he won it by a fraction of 1%. There's just no excuse for that. That isn't an outlier. It's out of orbit liar. So you just can't justify it. You can't make excuses for it. Some of them were just so wrong that it really makes you wonder whether we'll ever get back to a period where we had any real faith in polling. And polls are manipulated all the time. I saw one this morning coming out of a campaign in Virginia, claiming they were essentially in a statistical tie. Well, it's June, and for lots of different reasons, I don't believe that poll. I wouldn't believe any partisan poll in a campaign. But, the press reported it, was fascinated by it. Even though anybody who follows polling or has studied it knows how unreliable polls like that are, partisan polls taken by a campaign. Sometimes I feel like it's hopeless. No matter how many times you say something and how many times people rationally accept things, they won't pay attention. They won't act on what should be obvious, but apparently is not obvious. So the House, look, normally you would say from history that the House is gone. It'll go Republican, particularly because of redistricting. Democrats, in a sense, blew their chances to hold the House in the 2020s in 2010 under Obama, when they managed to lose that election so incredibly badly. And they've never regained the offensive. Even when they retook control of the House, they've never regained the offensive because of what happened in the state legislatures and with governors. That is, Republicans won so many of the critical state legislatures and governors, and they still control them. And we're not going to have any real redrawings in a lot of the key states because the Census Bureau is so late. They claim because of the pandemic, and that is part of it, but there are other reasons why too that are more partisan. So we're going to be operating in many cases under the old lines. I don't think Democrats are likely to carry the House again, but we have a crystal ball article this morning by a very able Alan Abramowitz down there at Emory University, who says if Biden can maintain his popularity and if the generic ballot, which is if the election were held today, would you vote Democratic or would you vote Republican? That's what a generic ballot is. If Democrats can maintain, high single digit support there, which more or less is where they are in some polling today, then Democrats have a shot at retaining the House, and maybe they do. It's awfully early, but I would say the odds are against them. But you can beat the odds. Many candidates do, many parties do. So we'll see whether that happens. But 2022, that's about all you can say about it. 2024, the big question is whether Trump is running again. He gives every sign of running again. I don't know whether he will or not. Some of it would depend on his health, I would think, but you never know. If he does run again, it's hard to see unless he's in jail or he's being tried at the time. It's hard to see how all these other Republicans who want to run will end up beating him for the nomination. But if he isn't indicted and he's not on trial and his health is reasonably good, then it's hard to see how they can defeat him. If he's the nominee again, Katie barred the door, and that's particularly true once the election is over. If it is even reasonably close, then the plans that are being cooked up in the Republican legislatures in states frequently with Republican governors, voter suppression of the Democratic vote. 14 states have already passed additional voter suppression legislation, some of it severe, as in Texas. And provisions in some of these bills, combined with what's already in the Constitution, enables the party controlling the legislature potentially to throw out the electors picked by the people because of fraud, non-existent fraud, and they will simply insert their own electors. People say, oh, that's outlandish. They'd never do that. Read the new bills. And remember what happened in 2000, or almost happened in 2000. If the courts hadn't acted to essentially install George W. Bush as president, the Florida legislature, which was heavily Republican then and had a governor, you might remember, with the same name as the Republican nominee for president, they were this close to throwing out any question of who won the electoral votes by installing the Republican electors and forwarding them to Washington. And that was the state that determined the difference. I mean, New Hampshire would have determined it if other stars had aligned, but Florida was the one that did. And I don't think there was any way around that. If they had sent in the Republican electors, given the composition of the Supreme Court of the United States, not of Florida, then could have happened then, would have happened then in all probability. So, people don't understand, and I'll wind up here and go to questions. People don't understand how many bombs are ticking away in the states, with state laws, in the Constitution, with, say, the provision whereby no candidate gets a majority of electoral votes, and then it goes to the House of Representatives, as it did back in 1824. You all remember that. Another great election that I enjoyed day by day, when John Quincy Adams, despite losing the popular vote and really losing the electoral vote, still became president thanks to the provision whereby each state casts one vote, and the person that gets a majority of the states wins. In this case, it'd be 26 votes. Well, Republicans are very likely to control more than 26 state delegations because they'll control many of the small states with a single member casting the vote for that state. And so Wyoming, with a tiny population, will have the same weight in the presidential election as California, with its enormous population. And so you need 26 of the states. Republicans will probably have more than 26. And so even if a Democrat has 20 million more votes or more in the popular vote, it's easy to see a way whereby a Republican will be installed as president. So, I guess you could say you can't change the rules in the middle of the game, although we haven't started that game yet, but we're not going to change it. We couldn't pass a constitutional amendment to declare Mother's Day an international holiday. That wouldn't be possible. We couldn't agree on the definition of motherhood. So there's no way we're going to revise the Constitution in any respect, probably, and certainly not with respect to this, even though it's absurd if you think about it. It's just absurd. I mean, you could have 20 to 25% of the population picking the next president under that provision of the Constitution as it currently exists. Now, do I think that provision is going to kick in 2024? The odds are always against it, but it's going to happen sometime. It is going to happen sometime, as it happened in 1824. And other things can be done in the interim. The state legislatures can, as Florida almost did in 2000, simply replace the electoral slates. Now, you talk about violence. I think you could all figure out what's going to happen if that occurs. And we're back to some kind of civil war. So on that cheery note, I hope I've really lifted you. I hope I've uplifted you. But if we don't start talking about reality and considering what's actually happening, as opposed to the Disneyland world that we often live in and hope will continue to live in, then things will really deteriorate to the point where this society might not survive as a democracy. Could have happened January 6th. Okay, Kyle, come on in and rescue me.
Hi, Larry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in today. And we've got a bunch of questions. And if you would like to submit a question, we'll be going until about 2 o'clock. You can tweet using the hashtag #AskSabato, or you can just send us an email at goodpolitics@virginia.edu. I'm going to be keeping an eye on that as we're talking here, so there's still time to submit a question. The first one here is from Clint Stevens of Lexington, South Carolina, and he asked about something you were just talking about, Larry, which was sort of as we look at our prognostications for 2022 in the House and Senate. Is there a way to sort of like, does the passage of some of these bills in Republican states, does that maybe, change the outlook of the election at all? Does that, how does that factor into our ratings of these races, if at all?
Well, it certainly has to factor in, because it's pretty obvious to anybody who looks at the laws that they help Republicans and they hurt Democrats. Right? That's why they're being passed by Republican legislatures and signed by Republican governors. And I think they know what they're doing. They know their business of politics. So, of course, it could hurt Democratic chances. If there's any silver lining to a dark cloud for Democrats, it might be, I don't want to be Pollyanna, it might be that when you try to take away people's votes or make it very difficult for people to vote, and you're as obvious about it as many of these states are being, you get people hopping mad. They get mad as hornets. And sometimes that increases their turnout because they don't appreciate being excluded. I could cite many examples. I'll cite one from my growing up here in Virginia. And many of you probably grew up in Virginia. And if you're old enough, you remember that Virginia had the lowest voter participation rate of any state in the country. Even in the South, which since the Civil War, or since Reconstruction, I should say, had pretty much depended on low participation to elect the governing clique within the Democratic Party, very, very conservative, racist Democratic Party. And those of you who study political science, you remember V.O. Key, famous political scientist of the 20th century, who in 1949 published a book called Southern Politics. And the chapter had a chapter on each Southern state and started off the chapter on Virginia by saying, by comparison to Virginia, Mississippi is a hotbed of democracy. Well, anytime you're being unfavorably compared to Mississippi, you know you have a problem. Sorry to those of you from Mississippi, at least in terms of politics, at mid-century. Okay, I think I narrowed it enough to save myself a little bit. Virginia had, in many cases, 8, 9, 10% of the eligible voters. Think about this, 8, 9, 10% of the eligible voters picking presidential electoral college seats and senators and governors and other statewide elected officials. Where were the other 90%? Well, you could say some of them were sheep. They simply didn't fight. Others, of course, African-American, Black, totally excluded. Many poor whites were also excluded because at that time they were considered unreliable by the organizations that ran states like Virginia. And what happened? Well, once the law aligned with the desires of people to participate, and this occurred mainly, not exclusively, but mainly in the 1960s, beginning with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act under Lyndon Johnson, and court decisions as well. When these people who were excluded from participation for so many decades, really a century or more, when they had the opportunity to participate, they turned up in enormous numbers and totally overthrew the governing oligarchies all across the South and in some other states as well. And so, you know, it's possible. I wouldn't predict it. I'm not that optimistic anymore. But I think it's possible that there could be that kind of reaction among those who are being suppressed by these new laws and whose vote is being disallowed or taken for granted or eliminated in some cases.
Next question is from Tom Eglinton from Asheville, North Carolina. Who would you forecast the chances that Donald Trump will inject himself into the midterms, potentially uniting the currently divided Democrats and dividing the Republicans, leading the GOP defeats when they could have otherwise had victories?
If Donald Trump is not on trial or in jail, and even if he is, I think the chances are, I don't know, somewhere around 99.9 to 100.0% that Donald Trump will inject himself. You know, back in January, after January 6th, and after the Electoral College votes were actually counted legally, and it was obvious to everybody but the cult, but QAnon and those other nutcases out there that number in the millions, that Joe Biden would in fact become president. After that was clear, I had a fair number of senior Republicans say to me, national and state, say to me, well, that's it. You watch. Donald Trump is going to fade into oblivion. We gladly are putting him into the past. This is leadership talking. Donald Trump has not faded one tiny little bit. He is center stage, exactly where he wants to be and likes to be, and where Republican leaders and rank and file want him to be or permit him to be. He's still there. And he's not going to yield that position unless he's forced to by an outside legal authority or judicial authority. Next, Kyle.
This one just came into goodpolitics@virginia.edu from Alan Bacon. Alan asks, could you comment on the implication for national politics of many cities such as Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis to not protect their populations from rioting? And I think this gets at the sort of the so-called law and order issue that I think probably is going to come up in 2022.
Well, I just want to say forthrightly, I'm opposed to rioting. And no one's going to change my mind, Kyle. You're not going to change my mind on that. I am totally, utterly opposed to rioting and violence in any form. Look, I don't know. I don't even know if that's true. But if they are, in fact, refusing to protect their populations, I don't think they're going to be in office very long. I haven't looked into the details of Portland and Seattle. And, that's on another coast. I'm getting old. I can only see to Maryland.
This is a question from Paige Tan at Radford University. You mentioned polling right now is pretty irrelevant for the fall 2021 Virginia races. What about the candidate selection process, conventions and primaries for the upcoming gubernatorial race? Does the turnout in the so-called unassembled convention that Republicans held a month ago, and then also more recently the primary on Tuesday, does that mean anything, you think, for what's coming up in Virginia in the fall?
Well, on the Republican side, if they had a regular convention, maybe it would have been 10,000. They've had conventions that were larger, but they've had conventions that were smaller. So maybe 10,000. They got about 31,000 people to participate. Now, they had projected well over 50,000. I think it was 53,000 they projected. They got 31,000 actually turning up. The Democrats got somewhere close to, once the final votes are thrown in there, close to 500,000. That's a pretty good total. It's not record breaking, but it's a good turnout. It's a good, solid turnout. Does it affect the results in the fall? I doubt it. There's a long time between June 8th and November 2nd. And I don't think by November 2nd, there'll be, 47 people who can remember what the turnout was or care. From June or the Republican quasi-convention, whatever the heck it was, May 8th. So I don't think it matters that much. But I will say this, on the Republican side, I don't know what Glenn Youngkin is. I think we're all going to discover this as time goes on. He's never held public office at any level. He's never cast a single vote publicly. I'm sure he's cast votes in elections, but we have a private ballot. I have no idea where he stands on a lot of these issues, other than the ones he commented on in running for the Republican nomination. It's clear he's very conservative. I don't think there's any question about that. It is clear that he has aligned himself to the extent needed with Donald Trump. There's a reason why Trump endorsed him so enthusiastically after he got the nomination, and said he was proud of that. And he also designated as either his top issue or one of his top three or something like that, election integrity. I've been here a long time. We don't have a problem with election integrity. Nationally, we don't really have a problem with it. Yeah, there are exceptions, like our friend Miles Coleman's Louisiana. Would be one I've always said. Bury me in either Louisiana or Chicago so I can continue voting. But Virginia has no problem of significance with election integrity. Now, where would that come from? Donald Trump, and the Trump people. Votes are being stolen, and look for those bamboo shreds in your ballot in case they were produced in Asia and pre-voted. Oh, please. I really, until relatively recently, I didn't understand just how many foolish people there were in our electorate in the United States generally, as interpreted by their belief in things that are utterly absurd and unproven, totally unproven. So in any event, they could have chosen a couple of real wackos. I won't mention them. I get enough correspondence but they didn't. They chose Youngkin, who, he's very conservative and he's clearly pro-Trump, but he's not by anybody's definition a wacko compared to a number of others we could name. On the Democratic side, you can criticize Terry McAuliffe all you want to. He would not have been successful in Virginia politics a few decades back. I think we could reasonably say that. But he's also moderate liberal, putting a label you want on there. But he is also, by no stretch of the imagination, a wacko. And you've got people, again, in both parties who fit that label ideologically. I'm not going to say if any of them are necessarily on the ballot on Tuesday, but how was McAuliffe picked? And he was picked in a massive landslide. He got over 62% of the vote, running against four candidates. And they were people who had public offices. They had been in the legislature or lieutenant governor, so that they were, in the traditional sense, qualified to run for governor. But Terry McAuliffe, I don't think there's any question about this, was the most moderate of the five. And he was picked because the Democratic Party electorate, the rank and file, doesn't believe what some of the national analysts keep saying, which is that Virginia's a blue state, that it's automatically going to vote Democratic anytime, anywhere, any year. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. It has since this last decade. First, I guess, statewide election, 2008 with Obama, but then it went Republican 2009. But that was the last time Republicans have carried Virginia. 2009, that was a long time, or not a long time ago. Actually, it wasn't that long ago, but it was still a very solid decade's worth of Democratic victories. But a Republican can still win, particularly in an off-year election when the turnout isn't going to be as high and nearly as high as in a presidential election. So I think, Democratic rank and file didn't want to take a chance. They wanted to pick somebody who, first of all, had already proven he could win under difficult circumstances. President Obama was in office when he ran for governor. And every other case since 1977, every 4 years, since we always have a non-incumbent victory, we can't have governors succeeding themselves consecutively. In every other case, the nominee of the president's party has lost in Virginia for governor. And McAuliffe's the sole exception. And he beat Ken Cuccinelli, if I remember, back in 2013, while President Obama was in office and wasn't especially popular at that point in Virginia. He had carried Virginia twice, but by narrow margins. And the Obamacare rollout was something of a disaster. Yet he managed to win anyway. That is, McAuliffe managed to win anyway. So Democrats made a pragmatic, practical choice. So I would simply say to you that there is still that predominant philosophy, inclination, whatever you prefer to label it, in Virginia.
We talked earlier about whether Trump is going to play a role in the midterms, and I think he will probably. But McAuliffe was on MSNBC after he got nominated, and he said, quote, "I don't think Trump has the courage to come to Virginia." And I thought it was hilarious because it was a real sign that McAuliffe really wants Trump to come to Virginia.
Of course he does.
Duncan is Trump all over again, and whether he can make that stick or not is a big question this election.
No, well, as far as Trump coming, that would be Youngkin's ultimate nightmare, even though, again, he's pro-Trump, said he was proud of Trump's endorsement. was enthusiastically endorsed by Trump. So, you have to generally take people at their word. When they tell you who they are, believe them, more or less. But he also knows, Youngkin that is, that Trump appearing in Virginia, given that Trump was defeated by over 10%, which is a massive margin in Virginia, which is more competitive than that, and was the largest Democratic victory margin for Biden, for any Democrat, since World War II in a presidential race. So, the man's not stupid. Youngkin understands that Trump appearing on Virginia soil for Youngkin is going to help McAuliffe. Some things are so obvious, it's barely necessary to articulate them.
Kind of the same question from two different viewers today, Elaine Nahai and Rich Cohn. They're basically asking why has American politics become so polarized along rural versus urban lines, and what sort of implications policy-wise does that split have?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think there's been insufficient research on that. There's been some research. I wrote a paper specifically about that. Well, look, first of all, rural communities, and I think rural people generally, though you have to separate them out by race and age and all kinds of other variables. But generally speaking, they have a more conservative outlook in values than do urban voters, who tend to be much more liberal on, you fill in the blank, on the social issues. I don't want to start talking about abortion and all the rest of it. So part of it is social issues. We have polarized on social issues, not just party ID. Party ID is related to the social issue polarization. So I think that's part of it. I remember the old studies about why we have a two-party system in America instead of 3 or 4 or 5 parties, as many European countries do and other parliamentary democracies do around the world. And one reason was because there is a natural division, a division of two in societies that are very complex in order to try to create governing coalitions, not necessarily majority coalitions, but governing coalitions. Maybe you win by 40%, as in Britain frequently, or some other percentage. And so maybe that's also why we tend to divide. We're going to find ways to divide. And one natural division is where we live and how we live and what our values are. Doesn't necessarily relate to history. I know a lot of you, just from what I've been told anyway, people who signed up for this live stream, a lot of you are Virginian. And you may recall a time when, for example, Southwest Virginia used to be heavily Democratic. And they would vote for anyone, liberal, moderate, conservative, who was Democratic, although not bird organization. And you had other places that were suburban that would automatically vote Republican because they identified with the Republican Party's values and concerns and so on. Well, now it's the opposite. Now Southwest Virginia is 70, 75%, sometimes 80% Republican. They love Trump out there. You have to search to find suburban localities that didn't defeat Trump in a landslide. So things change over time, but it's interesting that divisions remain. People focus in on the differences rather than the similarities in politics, as in the rest of life. I mean, we all do.
We're getting close to 2:00, so we'll just do a couple more questions. And the next questioner, I think, probably wins the award for furthest away question. He's watching in Lagos, Nigeria.
No, good.
Welcome. Apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, but thank you for sending in the question. So he asked, with both parties having to deal with push and pull ideological problems with factional elements in their respective parties, do you foresee a coming together of the center right and the center left to salvage the political system from the extremists of both parties?
No. Let's see. Now, let me elaborate. You can't throw anything at me. You're way too far away. Look, first of all, let's not have false equality. Let's not equalize the situation that exists in the two major parties. I'm sorry. I used to do that for a living, the on the one hand and then on the other hand, and, why both parties are too extreme. No, it really isn't true. A good piece of the Republican Party isn't too extreme. Not a majority. They didn't vote for Trump to begin with. They did vote for him in the general election, and then both general elections. But that is the party that is moving along more extreme lines. That is the party that, in essence, first sponsored and then covered up for the January 6th attempted coup. The Democrats didn't do that. I couldn't imagine the Democratic Party doing the same thing in similar circumstances if they had been on the losing end. It's really unthinkable. So you can't equate the left on the Democratic Party to the right or the QAnons or the Trumpists on the Republican Party side. You just can't. And if you do, frankly, I think those of you out there who do are part of the problem. You're part of the problem. And it's why we're in the dilemma we're in with democracy sinking in the United States, and it is sinking. And we can still rescue it. We can provide floaters, but we're going to have to work at it. So, no, I don't see that happening at all. I really don't. Because there aren't that many, there are almost no liberals left in the Republican Party, and there are damn few moderates. Susan Collins, let's see now. I guess you could name the people who voted for Trump's impeachment in one of the two or both of the impeachments, if you're looking at elected officials. And then you're looking at rational people who are conservative but deserve a lot of credit for having guts, like Adam Kinzinger and Congresswoman Cheney in Wyoming. They deserve a lot of credit for having guts and being just mauled by the nuts in that party. Okay? So that's exactly the way it is. On the Democratic side, are there way out liberals? Yeah, we've heard from a few of them today, saying things I don't even want to get into about very controversial international issues and other things. We don't have enough time to get into them. But we're talking about a much smaller slice of that party, and certainly very few who could be called undemocratic, small d. Whereas you can find a lot of people on the Republican side who question now the basis of democracy because they're not winning. In order to preserve their party, in order to keep their share of the power or augment it, we have to make adjustments. Why authoritarianism isn't nearly as bad as we once said. And that's what ought to worry everybody. And I know it doesn't. That's why I don't know where we're headed. And on that note, Kyle, we're going to end. I want to thank you for the great job you do at the Crystal Ball. Our managing editor at the Crystal Ball does a terrific job, and we have a fine group of people. I mentioned Miles Coleman with you there, but we also have a terrific group of student interns who really make a contribution. This is not just some academic enterprise. It is an enterprise where we involve students and I hope contribute to their education, and they contribute to ours, including a forthcoming documentary called Common Grounds, plural. Of course, UVA people know this is the grounds. It's not a campus. I'm right here at Pavilion 4 on the lawn. It's the grounds. I don't know how many times I still have to say that to correct people. But Common Grounds is about students from very different perspectives trying to find some common ground among themselves, beliefs in common. They're trying to find ways to bridge the divides. I hope they succeed. You hope they succeed. And we'll find out whether they do when we see this documentary. It's a student production. We provided the resources. We're helping them in any way we can, but it's their documentary, their ideas, their construct. And we're very excited about this, and it will be out in the fall, and you'll all get a chance, I hope, to see it. Again, thank you. Thanks to the Alumni Association. Look forward to seeing you all in person at reunions next year and at each succeeding year until, well, I'll always be on the grounds. It's just a question of whether it'll be above ground or below ground, but I'll see you for as long as I'm above ground.
With that, we're going to show the trailer for the documentary that Larry mentioned, Common Grounds, and thanks for joining us today.
I made the decision to run for president after Charlottesville. Close your eyes and remember what you saw.
Jews will not replace us! White lives matter! White lives matter! White lives matter! White lives matter!
The political environment at UVA right now is very tense, and I think that is the culmination of the events of the last 5-6 years. Trump's election in 2016, the events of August 11th and 12th, the 2020 election, the insurrection at the Capitol just a few weeks ago.
So how would you describe your political affiliation?
I would say principled conservative.
Very staunch, like moving to like leftist.
Is center-right, libertarian.
I identify as a progressive.
Conservative.
A Democrat.
Conservative.
Progressive liberal.
I'm a socialist.
What do you think about free speech?
Oh, God. Might need a minute.
The beauty of free speech is you do have, with the freedom to say stupid things, you've got the freedom to be able to say whatever you want, and that's, I think, the wisdom of the founders.
When it's bad behavior, and when you're morally incorrect, and when you are basically dehumanizing people within your free speech, that's when I have an issue with it.
Here at UVA, we have a strong culture of student self-censorship.
In this leaning Marxist culture where if we don't like it, we're just going to get rid of it. We're not going to debate it out. We're not going to challenge it. We're just going to cancel it.
I think we've really gotten away from the idea of civility, the idea that we need to have common ground and that we agree on certain fundamental principles.
I hate the fact that people are like, we need to be civil, because I'm like, I don't want to be civil. I want to be chaotic. I want to be creative and crazy, and I want us to question our world for the better.
If we want liberation, and if we want a revolution, are we going to get it by saying please and thank you, or are we going to get it by taking it